Valentine's Day, 1981, Centralia, Pennsylvania. Florence Domboski sent her 12-year-old son Todd out into the neighborhood on a small errand. Something was happening in Centralia that Saturday morning. A group of outsiders had arrived, important-looking people moving through the streets, and Florence wanted to know what was going on. In a town of just over 1,000 people, where everyone knew whose car was parked outside whose house, strangers warranted attention. They were, as it turned out, Pennsylvania state politicians touring the borough with local officials. Nobody had told the residents they were coming. Todd walked along Locust Avenue toward his grandmother's house at number 131. Near a grassy area beside a tree, he noticed thin wisps of smoke rising from the ground. He walked over to look. The earth dropped out beneath him. He fell into a hole that had not existed the moment before. A pit of warm mud and gas opening suddenly through grass that had appeared stable, swallowing him to the knees, then deeper as he struggled, then to his shoulders as the ground continued to give. The gases coming up from below were invisible. Their composition, established by later analysis, included carbon monoxide, at concentrations sufficient to cause unconsciousness within minutes and death shortly after. Todd screamed for help and seized a root from the tree at the hole's edge, the only fixed thing within reach. His cousin Eric Wolfgang, nearby, reached the hole in under a minute and pulled him out. The temperature at the bottom of the hole was later measured at 350 degrees Fahrenheit. The hole was not a geological event. It was not a water main failure or a sewer collapse. It had been made by fire that had been burning continuously in the abandoned coal mines beneath Centralia for the previous 19 years, moving through rock in the dark, uncontrolled, following the coal seams wherever they ran. The politicians touring the town that morning were briefed on what had just happened to a 12-year-old boy in his grandmother's backyard. The fire had been there since 1962. It had simply taken 19 years for the ground to give way where someone was standing. Centralia had been a coal town since before it was a town. Anthracite coal was first mined in the Centralia area in 1842, 20 years before the borough was officially incorporated. The anthracite fields of the Pennsylvania coal region were among the most densely worked mineral deposits in American industrial history. A band of hard coal running northeast to southwest through the mountains of Columbia and Schuylkill counties, extracted by generations of miners from the mid-19th century through the mid-20th. The work defined the region entirely. It determined where towns were built, how streets were laid, what the men did, and how they died. The geology of the hills around Centralia was not background. It was the reason the place existed. By the time coal was first mined in the Centralia area, the industry had been excavating anthracite from this region for 30 years. The mines ran horizontally into the hillsides and then downward along the coal seams, the Buck Mountain coal bed being the principal seam beneath Centralia itself, running at angles through the rock and intersecting over the decades with dozens of adjacent workings from neighboring collieries. When one mine closed, another opened nearby. When surface strip mining was introduced in the 20th century, the open pits cut through ground already honeycombed, with earlier underground works below. The relationship between the surface and the subsurface in Centralia was intimate and consequential. The town had been built above a labyrinth it could not fully map. By 1962, the mines were mostly gone. The Centralia colliery had closed. Strip mining had ceased. The population had fallen from its early 20th century peak, but still numbered approximately 1,100 people. A community of working-class families, many of whose parents and grandparents had mined the same ground beneath them, living in frame houses and brick row houses along streets that had once housed the most productive anthracite workforce in the county. The abandoned workings below their streets were not a present concern. They had been there for decades without incident. Nobody was thinking about the labyrinth. Nobody was thinking about the coal. On May 7, 1962, the Centralia Borough Council met to discuss the upcoming Memorial Day celebration and what to do about the landfill. The town had a problem with illegal dumping. 8 unauthorized dumps had spread across Centralia, a condition that new state regulations had forced the borough to address. The solution the council adopted was standard for the era: consolidate the dumping into a single controlled site in one of the old abandoned strip mine pits on the borough's eastern edge. The pit in question was approximately 300 feet wide, 75 feet long, and 50 feet deep, an open excavation near the Oddfellow Cemetery that had been cut into the hill in 1935. George Segeritas was a regional landfill inspector who worked for the Pennsylvania Department of Mines and Mineral Industries. He had examined the pit and found what he was looking for: holes in the walls and floor. In a region where strip mines routinely cut through older underground workings below, these openings were not unusual. they were dangerous. The existing regulations, passed in 1956 specifically because landfills in strip mines were known causes of mine fires, required that such a pit be filled with non-combustible material before any burning was permitted. Seguritas informed Joseph Ty, a Centralia councilman, of what the regulations required. The non-combustible barrier was never installed. The council authorized the burning anyway, in preparation for the holiday. On May 27, 1962, fire was set in the landfill pit. The trash burned. The fire reached the exposed coal at the pit's base and continued downward through the openings Seguritas had identified into the abandoned workings of the Buck Mountain coal bed below. Firefighters were called. They poured water on it. The following morning, the fire was burning again. The fire had entered the labyrinth. It would never come out. The years between 1962 and 1981 were a chronicle of interventions that arrived too late, cost too little, and failed in sequence. In November 1962, the first serious response began. Workers drilled into the fire and attempted to flush it with water and slurry. The project ran out of money the following spring before containment was achieved. In 1963, a trench was excavated along the fire's projected perimeter, intended to serve as a barrier. By the time it was complete, the fire had already crossed to the other side. A more extensive flush barrier plan was drawn up. It took years to secure the approvals, the property releases, and the funding. Work finally began in 1967. 5 years after the fire started. Drilling revealed the fire had by that point reached depths of 225 feet, too deep for the trench approach to be effective. Each failure generated a revised plan. Each revised plan required new approvals and new funding. The funding, channeled through the Pennsylvania Department of Mines and Mineral Industries and occasionally supplemented by federal appropriations, was never sufficient for the scale of the intervention the fire's progress required. Budget cuts repeatedly interrupted projects midway through execution. Engineers who had studied the mine maps understood the fire's trajectory clearly. It was moving northeast toward the densest residential sections of the borough, following the coal seams through the labyrinth of old workings at a pace that the underfunded response could not outrun. By 1981, more than $3.5 million had been spent on efforts to contain or extinguish the fire. Every one of them had failed. The fire was burning at depths up to 300 feet, moving through 3,700 acres of coal-bearing rock. Carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide were venting through cracks in the ground across the borough. Several residents along Locust Avenue and the surrounding streets had been measuring gas levels in their basements for years, recording concentrations that state health guidelines identified as dangerous. On the morning of February 14, 1981, the state politicians touring Centralia with borough officials had come to assess the situation. They were present, a few blocks away, at the exact moment the situation assessed itself. The day after Todd Domboski fell into the hole in his grandmother's yard, Governor Dick Thornburgh came to Centralia. He walked the streets. He was shown the hole. His administration provided temporary housing to 3 families whose homes were determined to be immediately unsafe. The Federal Office of Surface Mining accelerated its assessment of what it would take to either extinguish the fire or relocate the town. Neither option offered certainty. Extinguishing a coal seam fire, burning at 300 feet across thousands of acres, had no proven methodology at the scale required. Relocating an entire American borough was a logistical and political undertaking without modern precedent. The federal government's response arrived in 1984. Congress appropriated $42 million for a voluntary relocation buyout, an offer extended to Centralia's residents. The community fractured along the lines that such decisions always fracture. Some residents had lived in Centralia their entire lives. The decision to accept or refuse was individual. Their parents were buried in the Oddfellows Cemetery, within a few hundred feet of the strip mine pit where the fire had started. The churches, the organizations, the social fabric, these were not abstractions. Approximately 1,000 residents accepted the buyout and left. Their houses were demolished after the purchase. The streets they had stood on were graded to bare ground. Those who remained believed, or chose to believe, or could not leave, and the distinctions between those 3 positions were not always clear. The ground beneath the remaining houses continued to warm. In 1992, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania condemned all remaining properties in Centralia through eminent domain. The legal authority was not subtle. The fire presented a documented risk to life and property that the state was obligated to address. Most complied. A small group refused. The legal contest that followed lasted years. The holdouts argued that their properties were structurally sound. that their gas monitoring showed acceptable levels. The Commonwealth argued the hazard was ongoing, and the risk was real. Their right to remain was not superseded by a fire burning hundreds of feet below their foundations. In 2013, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court declined to review a lower court ruling upholding the condemnation. A settlement allowed the remaining residents to stay for the duration of their lifetimes. When they die, their properties will revert to the Commonwealth. The borough will be legally dissolved. The zip code was canceled in September 2003. The post office closed. The municipal services ended. The street signs remained in some sections, standing at intersections where no buildings remained, marking addresses that existed in public records and nowhere else. Route 61, the highway that had run through the center of town, buckled from subsurface heat and was closed to through traffic in 1994. A section of its old surface remains accessible on foot, cracked and fractured, with steam visible from the fissures in certain weather conditions. The Church of St. Ignatius still stands. The cemeteries still stand. The graves of the people who built Centralia remain in the ground above the fire that has been burning under them for more than 60 years. Centralia Borough has a population of 5. The Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection monitors the fire continuously. Its instruments track temperature, gas concentration, and the fire's movement through the coal seams. The most recent assessments place the active fire across an area of approximately 3,700 acres, at depths reaching 300 feet, moving through the Buck Mountain coal bed. The coal reserves available to sustain it are sufficient, at current consumption rates, for the fire to continue burning for more than 250 years from now. The people who will be alive when it finally exhausts its fuel have not yet been born. The Pennsylvania DEP's website carries a warning that the Centralia area is extremely dangerous, and that visiting the immediate zone could result in serious injury or death. The warning has not reduced the number of visitors. People come to stand on the buckled asphalt and take photographs of the steam rising through the cracks. The cemeteries are accessible and regularly visited by people who come to read the names on the headstones of a community that no longer exists above ground. Todd Domboski left Centralia after the buyout. He died in February 2022 at 53 years old. He spent 40 years living with the knowledge of what the ground felt like when it gave way. David DeCock, the journalist who covered Centralia for decades, described the heart of the fire in terms that geology alone cannot contain. A world where no human could live, hotter than the planet Mercury, its atmosphere as poisonous as Saturn's, temperatures at the core exceeding 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. That world is directly beneath Pennsylvania. It has been there since 1962. The Borough Council that authorized the landfill burning in May 1962 was trying to solve a problem the town actually had. The illegal dumps were a documented nuisance. Joseph Ty received that warning. The record does not show that he acted on it. The council voted to proceed. The fire was set. One decision, made by a small-town borough council in preparation for a Memorial Day celebration, is still burning through the Pennsylvania hills today. It will be burning when everyone who made it, and everyone who lived through its consequences, and everyone reading this account is gone. George Segeritis wrote his inspection report. He told the council what the regulations required. He was not heard, or not heeded, or not remembered. The town was evacuated. The houses were demolished. The streets were graded to grass. The fire continued. Centralia was built by people who spent their working lives taking coal out of the ground. The ground repaid the debt on its own terms, in its own time. The fire does not distinguish between the council members who ignored the warning and the 1,000 people who lived above what the warning described. It burns at 300 feet in the dark. It burns indifferent, moving through the coal toward the next available century. The street signs still stand at empty intersections. The ground is still warm. If you enjoyed the history of America's abandoned town, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel.